Welcome everyone to this virtual creative workshop. It's really exciting to be able to talk to you today about this subject, which is kind of my favourite subject and the basis of my research. May we have the next slide, please, Corey? So we're going to be thinking today about the relationship between creativity and resilience. And for me, those two things are sort of interchangeable. When you're being creative, you're being fundamentally resilient by using sort of non-exhaustive decision-making processes. When you're being resilient in a problem situation, you're being fundamentally creative by using adaptive principles and adaptive processes to create new material, whether you're an artist or whether you're dealing with a public and social crisis that we are now experiencing. So the structure of the talk today, first of all, we're going to think a little bit about what is resilience. And then I wanted to apply it to another crisis that we're facing at the moment, climate change. And there's a lot of research around transformational resilience and our environment at the moment happening, which is fascinating and which we can read both as an engagement with what we would like to do for our environment, as well as applying it to our own individual lives. And then I want to move on to think about resilience and the individual. So how can we use resilience? How can we find our resilience? And to do that, I might look at Carl Jung and individuation. I'm sure lots of you are very familiar with his writing, and he writes very compellingly about how we find our true selves. And then I wanted to think about resilience at home, as most of us are at home now a great deal. How do we find creativity at home? Many of you may have heard of Csikzentmihalyi and his book, the Flow. And he writes in this book about the flow state, which is the kind of access to creativity that we all have, that we can all access, even when we're washing the dishes. Okay, and then I thought it would be interesting to think about resilience in children and how do we make resilient families, and how do we recover from perhaps moments in our lives where we weren't allowed to access creativity in our own childhood. Jerome Bruner was a developmental psychologist, and he writes about possibility thinking. So we're going to think about the possibility of possibility. And then I just wanted to move on at the end of the talk to think a bit about resilience at work and in our economy, which of course is a huge question and not one we can answer today, but one that we can pose. And there are ways in which we can harness our own resilience to function in these difficult circumstances and to actually engage in innovating the way we work and what we produce with all the challenges that are ahead of us. One of my other interests is creativity in business, and how there is a huge amount of research now about how creativity is the heart of the economy in business, and that innovation thinking is something that businesses really want to engage in. And I think that's really important, that we recognise it is not just the province of artists. Next slide, please. Oh, okay, thank you. I can't quite see my titles. So what is resilience? Well, resilience is defined by the Oxford English Dictionary as the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. It comes from the Latin word to bounce back, and it is the ability of a substance or object to spring back into shape. And so it kind of means elasticity. So you may have experienced that yourself, that you go through a difficult time, but you find ways of coming back. You are engaged in a new way in your new life, but that process of bouncing back shows personal resilience. SAMI, Wellbeing and Resilience Centre, say that the constituent part of that is growth, that you always have growth when you have to bounce back from a challenge. And that's actually a theme of today's talk, that when we are most challenged, when we are most broken, we can create new pathways, new synapses, new scar tissue to actually go forward effectively. And they define resilience as effective problem solving, adaptability, positive coping, self-regulation, and social support. So all of those things come up in different ways around all of the thinkers we're going to be thinking about today. Self-regulation is very important, how we deal with ourselves in isolation, and social support, that we are never an island. We always at our most resilient and most creative when we find a resilient social network. So positivepsychology.com refines this idea and says that a resilient person works through challenges by using personal resources, strengths, and other positive capacities of psychological capital, like hope, optimism, and self-efficacy. And I just love this idea that we all have psychological capital, whether or not we doubt it during the lockdown, whether we doubt it during the times ahead with economic crisis, but we do have it, and that is a capital, that's an asset that we can use in our future. Next slide, please, Corey. So creativity and resilience, for me, they are the same thing. And I find both of them, both intellectually and personally, very exciting to be involved in. So creativity is my practice. I love, I'm a writer, but I also quite like when I'm pushed and I have to find resilience. I like the things that I find necessarily. So I think that if you're accessing one, you have access to the other necessarily. So creativity is at the roots of resilience, and resilience is at the roots of creativity. And I like the image of roots, that actually we are much stronger than we think. Our capacities, our ideas, our ingenuity go much deeper than we realize sometimes. And it's during a crisis that we find those roots. Next slide, please, Corey. So my practice is sort of in writing, and my interest is in the world of the arts. I've been reflecting for a long time about when, and I'm sure all of you who have done any kind of creative or work, or even making your own business or raising a family, you will know that finding resilience is the habit, I think, of the practice of making and remaking. And what I mean by that is it's getting into a habit of making a process where you make something and then you remake it unquestioningly. So you're not rigid, you're allowing change, you're allowing to throw ideas away, to put things together that don't make sense. So it's a kind of space where you allow yourself to be playful. And in that play, you find new ideas and you build resilience. For me, creativity, and we talk about this on the diploma a great deal, is disruption. So we are in the middle of the most disruptive event that maybe many of us have ever experienced. So we may be in the middle of the most creative event that any of us have ever experienced, which is not to underplay the tragedy and the difficulty that we're all experiencing around the world, but just that there will be things that emerge because of our resilience that mitigate circumstances we're in. Iteration, repetition, as an artist, as a writer, drawing, making things, going wrong, saying it's okay to go wrong, absorbing failure, enjoying failure, divergence, allowing yourself to put two completely different ideas together and feeling the spark between them. That's a very resilient way of thinking. That's a fearless way of thinking. Allow yourself to do it. Allow yourself to think outside of your normal kind of belief system, and you might be surprised what emerges. The other thing artists love, apart from cutting off the word from, which is not very resilient in this slide, is moving towards and away from the question. So what is the question you want to answer? What's the problem that you're inhabiting at the moment? Move towards it, move away, move around it. There are many, many different ways to answer a question. And as an artist, that's your practice. That's something that you're developing as a way of finding an answer eventually. Tolerating ambiguity is a very difficult thing to do. And we found this on the diploma, that it's very difficult for students to come and for us to say, there's no one answer to what creativity is. It's multiple and you find your own path. But actually, if you can tolerate ambiguity, then you open yourself to a huge world of intellectual and sensory and creative possibility. And Keats called this, in a letter to his brother-in-law, negative capability, which is the capacity to stand in what feels empty and to not sort of claw after reason and certainty. It's very, very hard to do. But at the moment, I feel we may all have actually done this, and that the resources that we find are very exciting and useful for the rest of your life. So next slide, please, Corey. So the challenges to us now, of course, we all know are enormous and multiple. We have climate change, we have social inequality that is really being addressed now, I think, in a way it has never been addressed before, which is very powerful and very exciting. We have world poverty, we have children living in poverty, and of course we have COVID. So what are we going to do with all of these things? What can we do with them? Are they going to overwhelm us, or can we function around them and inside them? So next slide, please, Corey. So first of all, I wanted to think about climate change, and there's a lot of research around ecosystem science that uses resilience as its theme. So in designing regenerative cultures, Weil says that there's too much disturbance could lead to systemic degeneration, but at the same time, periodic disturbance within limits could also contribute to an ecosystem's transformation to a more diverse and more vibrant dynamic equilibrium condition. So I'm very interested in that distinction between huge disturbance, endless disturbance, which causes degeneration, but limited disturbance. It seems to me that in every part of our life, we want some disturbance, we want some abrasiveness, we want something to react against. And so this scholar believes that the problems that we are facing now could lead to a transformation in the problem, and finding solutions as we go along. And next slide, please, Corey. So this is called transformational resilience in ecosystem science. And I thought it would be useful to look at this for a personal use as well. These ideas are transferable between kind of research bodies. How do we want to use transformational resilience? We may all maybe have done that in our lives already. So transformation involves fundamental change, which in the context of sustainability requires radical systemic shifts in values and beliefs, patterns of social behavior, and multi-level governance and management regimes. So this is what is happening to us now. We are having radical systemic shifts in values and beliefs, and we are undergoing an absolute transformation, whether we like it or not, at the moment. And I feel like we are finding many ways of talking about social resilience as well as ecosystem resilience, and the ways in which lockdown has actually benefited the environment. So on the Resilience Alliance website, which you may want to look at if you're interested in this subject, there's 3 phases for transformation. So you might apply these to your own life. There's preparing for change. We didn't get much chance to prepare for COVID. Navigating the transition. Sometimes the navigation is very bumpy, but that doesn't mean you don't learn a great deal. And 3, building resilience of the new trajectory of development, which is, I think, very much what almost every work conversation and every social conversation is about at the moment. Next slide, please, Corey. So if any of you are interested in ecosystem resilience, then this book, Transformational Resilience by Bob Doppelt is very good. He bases his ideas around how we deal with making our environment more resilient, our world more resilient, by looking at trauma theory. Some of you may know this. It is based around ideas of how resilient we are and how we process stress in our bodies and in our minds. And trauma theory is about when a trauma is when internal or external resources of an individual or group are overwhelmed by real or perceived threats, which is exactly what's happened at the moment. But we don't need to stay in the trauma. We can find adversity-based growth, which means that we are not returning to the same level of function pre-crisis, but we are undergoing profound life-changing shifts in the way we think about our worlds and ourselves. And I felt like immediately in March, after we knew we were going to lockdown, there were very interesting discussions in our media about what we want after this, as if COVID has given us permission to think differently. Now, Doppelt thinks that beneficial psychological changes result as a consequence of people's struggle. So there is this emerging idea that when we struggle, it may be very painful, it may be very difficult, but we have some reward, we find something new. So how do we find these benefits? Next slide, please, Corey. So his model is called the resilient growth model, and it's just quite useful to apply this, I think, to any problem in your life. And he calls the first part of it presencing presencing skills to regulate fear. You ground yourself to stabilize your nervous system. You remember your resources, your strengths, your social support system, and you observe in a non-judgmental, self-compassionate way. So it's very like mindfulness, but this is actually his advice how to cope with climate crisis. And then you have purposing skills to find meaning and direction, because meaning and direction is the root of our resilience and creativity. You watch for new insights because you will have new knowledge. You tap into the values that you want to live by. You may even write them yourselves. And you harvest hope, he says, by making choices to increase personal, social, and environmental well-being. So that's his kind of strategy for finding a path and for finding resilient behavior within a problem. Next slide, please, Corey. So thinking a bit more about how we might apply this to our individual lives, Carl Jung wrote in his book, Man and His Symbols, he writes about individuation, and he talks about the collective unconscious, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And he calls the idea of the collective unconscious the magical layer of the psyche, the layer that we all have, that we all engage with when we're born into the world, with a strata and network of stories and symbols that we spend our whole lives interpreting and uncovering. So what is the collective unconscious? Jung says that it's the reservoir of universal human experience, actual and potential. So it's universal, it belongs to all of us. And there's a picture of Jung on the left, looking at a unus mundus, which is a symbol of sort of entirety, how everything in the world is connected. And the components of the collective unconscious are the archetypes, the symbol and myth. So you may know the hero archetype, the mother archetype, symbols of the child hero. We all understand these stories through our culture, in every culture as we are growing up, and they're part of our consciousness for all of us. And we create meaning from our own discovery of this universal core of archetype. So there we are in the huge world with its multiple meanings, but how do we find a sense of self? So Jung says that our personal history and our archetypal patterns, the things that we do because our society, we've always done them, are always interwoven. Then they need first to be separated and then linked back together. So he has this idea that we separate from the unconscious, the collective unconscious, and we individuate ourselves. We separate ourselves, we find ourselves, and then we come back to our society. We come back to that world of meaning. And he thinks that the collective unconscious never disappears, that the psyche that we share is the wellspring from which all else flows. And Jung believed that symbols, myths, cultural language is not just important to us, it is actually the thing that keeps us alive, which has been very interesting when we've lacked museums, music, theatres, cinemas, that these things are vital to our life. Next slide, please, Corey. So for Jung, finding resilience and finding creativity is process and dialogue. So how do these symbols, mythic structures and archetypes help us to find our subjective individual path to objective awareness? How do we go from ourselves to seeing ourselves? And he thinks that the collective unconscious is a creative matrix for the personality. It's the way we find ourselves, it's the path to ourselves. And Jungian analysis is not concerned with making the unconscious conscious. We can't do that in Jung's view. It's too big, it's too deep. We'll never know everything. We can't stratify it and rationalize it. And it's not like Freud about analyzing past difficulties, where Jung felt that we get stuck. But it's about finding a process of coming to terms with our unconscious in order to deal with future difficulties. And he does this, he says, by continuous dialogue with the unconscious. So he's always talking, we're always talking to our unconscious, and it's always talking to us. So it never stops. It's dialogic, it's very creative, it's very dramatic. And he thinks that resilience is the creative integration of psychological experience. So you may have traumatic experiences, you may have difficult experiences. When you creatively integrate those by looking at who you are and working with the collective unconscious, then you find your resilience and you find yourself. Next slide, please, Corey. So this is a different example here. This is moving on to perhaps, you know, a much more practical view of what creativity and resilience are. And this is Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who is a psychologist, an amazing psychologist. And his idea about the unconscious and creativity and resilience is that the unconscious is a phenomenological model of consciousness based on information theory. So information theory is sort of the antithesis to Jung. It's very practical, it's very handy, it's accessible to all of us without spending lots of money on Jungian therapy or going and doing lots and lots of fine art courses, or you can access it immediately, and it's democratic, and it deals directly with events, phenomena as we experience and interpret them, and it's not based on anatomical structures or neurochemical processes or unconscious purposes like Jung. So he believes that this model of the consciousness is that the functions of consciousness is to represent information about what is happening outside and inside the organism in such a way that it can be evaluated and acted upon by the body. So this dancer below is making probably millions of sort of synaptical decisions as he moves, and he makes choices about experience. And I wanted to demonstrate that Csikszentmihalyi's idea of creativity is that it's experienced through the body. It's processed from the world into you, and then you give it back to the world. So it's quite dialogic. Next slide, please, Corey. So he says that we order our experience. We are responsible for our experience, how we experience crises. We can change our mood regardless of external reality by changing the content of our consciousness. So consciousness is intentionally ordered information. We decide what we focus on, what we want to take from the world, and then that defines us. And he calls this intentionality. So where we put our intention, we find our reality. He says that the self directs attention. So you might want to spend a great deal of time looking at underwater flora. You might go there, you know, as a young person, you might have a passion for the theatre or for deep sea diving, and you direct your attention to that and you become really good at it. And then that attention that you have directed then determines your personality. And then your personality goes back and does more research into theatre or whatever it is that you love. And he calls this a causal circularity. So that's how we're creating our individuality. It's through our intention. Next slide, please, Corey. So he calls this a flow experience, and flow is the creative state that we inhabit when we're making something, and it's the optimal experience of self. And this is information coming into awareness is congruent with your goal. So if you want X or Y in life, you want to live in a certain way, the information from the world is allowing you to find that. It feels good, it feels flowing. The psychic energy is flowing and you have a flow experience. Maybe if you're drawing for hours or you're cooking for your family a special meal, and it's kind of, you're not thinking very much, it's becoming quite sensory. And this is called negentropy, and that's the order to your consciousness. And the opposite of that is depression, when we're blocked and we can't be creative. Next slide, please, Corey. So how do we build flow? Well, a bit like Jung, he says that complexity, difficulty in life, is the result of differentiation and integration. So we find our resilience, we find our flow by differentiating ourselves and then integrating. And I love this idea. We move towards a uniqueness, we value ourselves, we separate from others, and then we have to go back to others and we find a union with others in our community, in our society, and we have an interest in ideas and entities beyond ourselves. So we can't be truly creative or resilient if we're narcissistic. Next slide, please, Corey. So he calls this the autotelic self. We're all autotelic. We all have capacity to be autotelic. That means self-directed, auto, self, and teleology, meaning meaning. We find our own meaning. And selves that are creative are naturally resilient, and they translate potential threats into enjoyable challenges. They have self-contained goals. We know what we want. We find it ourselves. We don't let anyone tell us what we want. And that our goals emerge from experience evaluated in consciousness from self-proper. And he means by self-proper, that's ourselves. That's not a social self that we construct in relationship to the values of our society. That's who we want to be. Next slide, please, Corey. So how do we become autotelic? The good news is it's not very difficult. You set goals. So he says, have aspirations, and it doesn't matter how small they are or how great they are. Set your intentionality. Where do you want to go? Who do you want to be? Allow yourself to become immersed in activities. You know, forget time, forget where you are, enjoy yourself. Pay attention to what is happening. Sustain concentration. That's almost meditative. What is happening, and not think around it, and learn to enjoy the immediate experience, and be in the present moment. So that's his advice. It sounds simple, maybe it's hard to practice, but it's accessible to all of us. And he thinks flow is the creativity, the development of creativity beyond limits. Next slide, please. So briefly, I just wanted to talk to you about how to build resilient children, which we all want and we all will need for the future. So Jerome Bruner writes about how important creativity and storytelling is in children's learning. And he says in this extract, I won't read all of it because we're short of time, but that children don't need the completion of a logical argument to understand a story. This helps them to think about facing the future. So this idea fascinates me, that we don't need to know everything. We don't need to get to the end of the sentence with an answer. We just need to get to the end of the sentence. And if we teach children that that's okay, then somehow we can help them face an uncertain future, which every generation does face. Now, he calls this possibility thinking, you know, and it's a wonderful, powerful idea, and it's the core of creative learning. And it's kind of defined by posing the question, what if? And I love that. What if? You can ask yourself tonight, what is it that you are stopping yourself doing? What if you did it? And this kind of thinking is exemplified by the shift from what is this and what does it do, to what can I do with this? So that shift from saying, well, what is going on and what's happening, to hang on, what do I do to change this? What do I do to ameliorate this? Is for me the core of resilience. And when we can do that, we are very powerful. Next slide, please. Briefly, Donald Winnicott, as I said earlier, he thinks that playfulness, being full of play, is at the heart of resilience. And I will just précis this, that our capacity for being ourselves, feeling genuinely alive, is fostered by the practice of childhood play. So spontaneity, that engaging in process without needing an answer that children do, that is at the heart of creativity, but we can engage in that too as adults. It's not cut off from us. So we can access that at any time to resource ourselves and to build our resilience in our adult life. Next slide, please. I wanted to introduce you to another book called Antifragile, The Things That Gain from Disorder by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. Antifragility is a fascinating idea, and he thinks that it's his theory that antifragility is a property of systems that increase in capability to thrive as a result of stressors, shocks, volatility, etc. So when you are most threatened, it's possible to thrive most as a result. It's a difficult idea. It doesn't undermine the difficulties that people face, but it is a very exciting feeling of potential. He says that antifragility is beyond resilience or robustness. It's actually one step further. The resilient resists shocks and stays the same. The antifragile gets better. So he says if you tear the branch off a tree, the tree will grow scar tissue and a new branch, but that branch will be stronger because of the scar tissue. So that's a really interesting way to think about damage or scarring or difficulty. It's adding, it can add to our lives. Next slide, please, Corey. So taking that idea, how do we find growth in lockdown now in our economy, in our work practices? It's not all bad news. So Stephen Meek at the University of Nottingham on his Vision blog says that lockdown is driving digital and other innovations in the way we work, socialise, exercise and enjoy culture, which may have lasting impact. So I'm sure we all know they will have impact, but he says they also have benefits. We're at a very exciting point now where we don't know what the benefits will be. We don't know how the economy will work. The paradigm is utterly fresh. It will be hard, but there really is space for possibility. And his question is how to build a fairer and more resilient society. So that word fairer comes up a lot. It seems we want something more than just a good economy. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to précis this. what I was interested in was doing research for this about resilient economies, was that recovery policies seem to focus on well-being and inclusiveness. And I'm very interested in the amount of social discourse we've had in the last 3 months. It's just risen to the surface. So as we're trying to build a strong economy again, it seems to me that the way through that is to be thinking about how we work together, how we can be creative together. And I feel like there's great possibility for social and creative resilience in that. We want to build back better. We just don't want to build back. That's a very exciting place to be. Next slide, please, Corey. Okay, so very briefly, business creativity is something that really fascinates me. It was one of the top skills for LinkedIn in most demand for businesses at the moment. So we've never been more interested in applying creativity to find resilient practice in business. And certainly that's at the heart now of the language of many business innovators. Next slide, please, Corey. The last thing I want, just about business creativity, is that in this list of what business creativity does, you know, it's competitive, it nurtures our cultures, it aids productivity, it solves problems. That's the fundamental nature of creativity, is that we want to solve problems with it, but it changes the world. And I think that throwaway line at the end, it's so huge, but it has so much potential in it. I would take you back to the beginning of the talk, where we're thinking about divergent thinking, negative capability. It seems that these processes are relevant to all of our life, in all areas of our life at the moment. Next slide, please, Corey. I won't go through this in detail, but it's just a really interesting question about how do we create a resilient workplace? We want to think about mental health in lockdown. How do we do that when we're separate? How have you created your work environment at home with light, plants? How have you created a space, a social meeting space within lockdown? The ways in which we can be resilient at work by having flexibility, which probably will increase now post-COVID, and thinking about counselling, support, things that are available to employees. So remembering that Jung wants us to come back, and so does Csikzentmihalyi, back into the community, that being resilient is also asking for help. Next slide, please. So my last question is, what can we do with this? To go back to possibility thinking, what can we do with all this possibility? How do you find resilience? What's useful for you in the micro parts of your life and in the professional world too? But I think it's a really good question that we have an opportunity to do something. Next slide, please, Corey. So just to reiterate, the programs I teach on are the Masters in Creative Writing, the Masters in Writing for Performance, the Diploma in the Theory, History and Philosophy of Creativity. And a lot of these ideas will be in the diploma. And that's a kind of a very guided route through 2000 years of paradigm shifts and disruption and creative chaos. And it's been very enjoyable to run. So if you have any questions about anything I've been talking about or any of those courses, then please don't hesitate to email me, ad2030@cam.ac.uk. Thank you very much.